Two little girls in matching skirts walked into a billionaire's office with homemade resumes and one bold request: "We want to work instead of our mom." What they didn't know was that their words would change everything. The morning had a quiet chill as the elevators opened on the 27th floor of Harris & Company, one of the most powerful financial firms in Manhattan. Most of the employees hadn't arrived yet, only the early executives and assistants preparing the day's reports. The polished floors gleamed under the soft ceiling lights, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, and the glass walls revealed a skyline still waking up under the soft gray light. Then came the soft, almost unnoticed sound of tiny shoes tapping against marble. Two little girls, no more than 6 years old, stepped out of the elevator hand in hand. They were identical, same height, same big curious blue eyes, same chestnut brown hair tied back neatly with white headbands. Each wore a crisp white shirt tucked into a simple denim skirt, white knee socks, and shoes that were just a bit too clean for a typical 6-year-old. Light blue backpacks were snug on their backs, and in their hands, they each held a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. They walked past the reception desk with the seriousness of someone on an important mission. One of the assistants stood up, confused. "Girls? Are you lost?" she asked gently. "No," said one of the twins, not looking up. "We have a meeting." "A meeting?" "Yes. With Mr. Daniel Harris." Before the assistant could respond, the girls had already moved down the hall with quiet determination. The glass doors to the CEO's office loomed ahead, intimidating even to senior staff. But the girls didn't pause. They pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. Daniel Harris was sitting at his desk, absorbed in reading a report. He barely glanced up at first, expecting to see a colleague or assistant. But when he noticed two small figures standing silently near the door, he blinked and slowly lowered the file in his hands. The contrast between them was surreal. The man in the sleek light gray suit, sharp-featured and composed, with deep brown eyes and the air of someone used to controlling everything around him, and two tiny girls who barely reached the edge of his desk. He stood up immediately, unsure whether to be alarmed or amused. Hello?" he said. Are you lost?" The girls shook their heads. One of them stepped forward and extended her paper with both hands. "We came to apply for a job," she said. Daniel stared at her, then at the paper. "A job?" "Yes," the other girl chimed in. "We want to work instead of our mommy." There was a long pause. Daniel blinked. Then blinked again. The room fell completely silent except for the hum of the city outside. He stepped around his desk and knelt slightly so he could be eye level with them. "Wait," he said carefully, "who is your mom?" "Emma Gray," the first girl replied. "She works here. She cleans at night." Daniel frowned, surprised. The name was vaguely familiar. He remembered seeing it on a staff list, probably under janitorial services, but he had never met her in person. Still, his eyes searched theirs. "She always comes home really tired," said the second girl. "She tries not to show it, but we hear her crying in the bathroom." "She doesn't know we know," the first added. "We want to help her." Daniel looked down at the paper in his hand. It was brightly colored printer paper, and at the top there was a hand-drawn picture of a house, a sun, and 3 stick figures labeled Mommy, Me, and Me Too. Below that, written in large uneven letters, was what could only be described as a resume, a list of simple abilities like, can make coffee, clean up toys, and don't spill juice. He had reviewed thousands of resumes. None had ever looked like this. The girls stared at him expectantly, with a mix of hope and fear that no child should have to wear on her face. Daniel felt something shift inside him, quietly, but unmistakably. He was used to managing empires, to thinking in terms of numbers and quarterly goals. But at this moment, all of that seemed to fall away. He cleared his throat. "Girls," he said softly, "you're very young. You should be playing, not working. They both nodded solemnly. We know, said the first. But someone has to help Mommy. Daniel didn't have a response. Not right away. He simply stood there, holding the small, wrinkled paper, while two 6-year-old girls waited for him to say something that might change everything. Emma Gray's world was a quiet one. Not the kind of quiet that brought peace, but the kind that sat heavy on the chest and lingered in every corner of her small apartment like dust that couldn't be swept away. Every morning began the same, the alarm at 4:45 a.m., her body aching from the night before, the dull soreness in her knees from hours spent on tile floors, and the hollow echo of silence before the girls woke up. She would steal a few minutes for herself, sometimes just to stare at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, sometimes to sit at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee while trying not to cry. She couldn't afford the luxury of breaking down. There was no one to catch her if she did. She had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer. She could still remember the scent of old law books, the sharp thrill of debate club, the certainty that she was building something. But when her husband Michael died in a sudden highway accident during her second year of law school, everything unraveled. 2 newborn daughters, no family nearby, and a mountain of bills that didn't care about grief or dreams, only numbers and due dates. She dropped out, telling herself it was temporary. Then came the first cleaning job, then a second, and by the time the girls were 3, she was working nights so she could care for them during the day. 1 part survival, 1 part guilt. The job at Harris & Company had been a blessing in disguise. Stable hours, a decent wage for a cleaning job, and health insurance. She worked when the lights were dimmed and the executives were gone, her footsteps the only sound in the long glass corridors. She learned the rhythm of the office, who left crumbs in the conference room, which printer jammed most often, and which executives couldn't be bothered to throw away their own coffee cups. She never spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary. That wasn't part of her job, and she wasn't interested in drawing attention. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to get through each shift, collect her paycheck, and keep her daughters clothed, fed, and safe. Some nights she found herself pausing in the executive wing, staring at the skyline from the 27th floor with her gloves still on and the mop beside her. She'd look at the distant lights blinking in the towers and wonder what her life might have been if Michael hadn't died. If she'd graduated. If she had been the one behind one of those glass desks instead of outside cleaning its fingerprints. The weight of those thoughts pressed hard against her ribs, but she'd push them down and move on. Always move on. Lily and Sophie were her light. They were identical in appearance, but their personalities had already begun to split like morning and dusk, Lily quiet and curious, Sophie bold and impulsive. They watched everything. Emma tried to shield them from the truth of her exhaustion, but children have a way of seeing through even the best disguises. She smiled when she was tired, laughed when she wanted to cry, and brushed off questions with gentle lies like, "Mommy's just sleepy," or "Everything's okay, sweetheart." But children are smarter than we give them credit for. The night before the girls appeared at Daniel Harris's office, Emma had come home later than usual. There had been a spill on the 22nd floor that took an hour to clean, and her supervisor had insisted on inspecting everything before anyone left. By the time she walked through the apartment door, the girls were asleep on the couch, hugging each other like they'd known for sure she wouldn't make it to tuck them in. Emma had stood in the doorway, shoes still on, and something inside her cracked so quietly it didn't make a sound. She sat on the floor of the hallway and just let the tears fall without trying to hide them. That was the night Lily and Sophie overheard her sobbing in the bathroom. That was the night they decided to do something. They didn't tell her. They whispered to each other in their bedroom, pulling out markers and colored paper from their art drawer. They wrote down everything they thought made them qualified. We clean up our toys, we can make peanut butter sandwiches, we know how to turn on the coffee machine. They practiced what they would say. They folded the paper just right and packed it with care. And the next morning, before Emma even woke up, they quietly got dressed, put on their backpacks, and left. Emma didn't know they were gone until an hour later, when she came out of the bathroom and found 2 empty beds. Her heart nearly stopped. While she ran down the street barefoot, asking neighbors if they'd seen the girls, Lily and Sophie were already riding the subway uptown, asking a kind-looking woman which stopped to get off at 4, the biggest office building near the park. Back in her apartment, Emma searched the whole neighborhood, then finally called the police, her voice trembling, certain that something terrible had happened. She had no idea her daughters were walking straight into the life she used to dream of, armed with paper resumes, stubborn hope, and the kind of courage only 6-year-olds are capable of. Daniel Harris sat back in his leather chair, still holding the piece of paper one of the girls had handed him. It was creased neatly down the center, slightly smudged at the corners where their small fingers had gripped it tightly, probably all morning. The paper itself was light blue and faintly scented with what he guessed was strawberry shampoo, the kind they likely used. Across the top, drawn with thick crayon lines, was a child's rendering of a house with 3 figures underneath a yellow sun. Each stick figure had been labeled in uneven block letters, Mommy, me, and me too. Underneath the picture began what could only be described as the most unorthodox resume he had ever seen. It wasn't filled with references or job titles. There were no bullet points listing achievements or skills sharpened over years in the workforce. Instead, it said things like, we can wipe tables really fast, we know how to fold clothes the way our mommy likes, and we never forget to say please and thank you. There was even a line that read, we can make coffee, but we can't reach the top shelf yet. At the bottom, in slightly slanted capital letters, were the names Lily Gray and Sophie Gray, written like signatures they had practiced very carefully, possibly more than once. He should have smiled. It was, in any other context, charming, sweet, even. But he didn't smile. He couldn't. Because behind every innocent claim of responsibility was a reality he wasn't sure he could ignore. This wasn't a joke, and it wasn't pretend. These girls had shown up alone, taken the subway by themselves, walked into a Manhattan skyscraper, and asked for a job. Not because they were bored or adventurous, but because they believed they needed to. Because something in their 6-year-old minds told them that their mother was suffering and that they, somehow, could fix it. Daniel looked up from the paper and studied the girls more closely. They stood straight, hands by their sides, the kind of posture you see in children who've learned early that being polite and still gets adults to listen. Their white blouses were tucked neatly into their skirts, though Sophie's socks had slouched a little, and Lily's collar was slightly off-center. But they had made an effort to look presentable, to be taken seriously, to matter. He felt something stir in his chest, something rare and unsettling. It wasn't pity exactly. It was deeper than that, and heavier. He tried to speak, but his words caught. So instead, he slowly crouched in front of them, balancing on the balls of his feet, meeting their eyes at their level. They didn't flinch or giggle or look away. I want you to tell me why you're really here, he said softly, holding the resume between his fingers. You came here all by yourselves. That's a big thing. So tell me, why? Lily glanced at Sophie first, then stepped a little forward, her fingers nervously toying with the hem of her skirt. Because Mommy's really tired. Every night. She comes home after we're asleep, and she thinks we don't hear her cry, but we do. She cries in the bathroom when the shower is running. She doesn't think we know, but we do. Sophie jumped in quickly, her voice firmer. She says she's okay, but she's not. Her hands hurt. Her feet hurt. She sometimes forgets to eat breakfast because she's trying to get us ready. And she only buys stuff for us. Never for her. Daniel blinked, once. Twice. Then he gently asked, and you thought, if you worked, that would help? They both nodded. Lily said, if we do her job, even just some of it, she can sleep more. Or maybe go back to school. She has smart books on her shelf that she never reads anymore. Sophie added, and we're really good at cleaning. We clean our room every day. Even under the bed. Daniel didn't know what to say. In his world, people handed him neatly printed resumes, polished speeches, and aggressive self-promotion. No one ever asked him to believe in them based on sincerity alone. No one ever stood silently and let their eyes do the convincing. And yet, here were two 6-year-olds doing exactly that. No manipulation. No agenda. Just love, raw, unfiltered love, for someone who had given them everything and asked for nothing in return. He looked down at the paper again, then to the backpacks on their shoulders. He wondered if they had packed lunches or if they had any idea what people did in an office all day. He also wondered where their mother was right now, if she even knew they were gone. The thought made his heart beat faster. I think, he started slowly, choosing his words carefully, I think you're two of the bravest little girls I've ever met. But your job, right now, is to be kids. That's the most important job in the world. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. But Mommy can't quit her job. She said so. Even when she's sick. She still goes. Daniel exhaled quietly. His mind was already racing ahead, to the company files, the staff logs, HR policies. He didn't know who Emma Gray was beyond a line in the janitorial schedule. He had never paid attention. But now he felt he couldn't ignore it if he tried. He stood up slowly and walked to the intercom on his desk. Emily, I need you to cancel my next 2 meetings, he said. And call building security. Ask if they've seen or heard anything about 2 children arriving this morning without a parent. I need to locate their mother immediately. The girls didn't seem afraid of what he was doing. They simply stood there, quietly waiting, as if they had done all they could and the rest was up to him. Daniel sat back down behind his desk, holding their resume with both hands, staring at it again as if it were something sacred. In some strange way, it was. It was a plea for help disguised as a child's drawing. It was a blueprint for love that had run out of options. And somewhere deep inside, beneath years of corporate armor and calculated decisions, Daniel Harris felt something thaw. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't let this go. Not this time. By the time Daniel Harris stepped into the Human Resources Records office later that afternoon, the weight of the morning still hadn't lifted from his chest. The image of those 2 girls, so serious, so sincere, had lodged itself deep in his thoughts like a small, persistent thorn. As he walked past rows of filing cabinets and quiet clerks immersed in paperwork, he realized just how much of his company remained invisible to him. He knew the names of department heads, the quarterly margins, the profit forecasts down to decimal points. But people like Emma Gray, people who cleaned the floors he walked on, he had never truly seen them. The HR assistant raised her eyes when she saw him approach, clearly startled to find the CEO standing at her desk unannounced. Daniel was not known for casual visits. I need the employee file for Emma Gray, he said. Janitorial staff. I believe she works nights. The woman nodded quickly, fumbling through a cabinet, then handed him a plain brown folder with her name typed neatly across the top. He opened it and flipped through the basic forms: employment start date, emergency contact, hours worked, health insurance, tax paperwork. It was all so clinical, stripped of anything human. Just boxes and numbers. Nothing in those pages said anything about who she really was. He scanned further and found a short application she had filled out when she was first hired 3 years ago. It had a handwritten note attached: former law student. Took extended leave due to family emergency. Willing to work nights. Strong work ethic. A note from the previous supervisor added: punctual. Quiet. Never misses a shift. Daniel paused at that. Never missed a shift. That meant for over 3 years, Emma Gray had shown up to this building almost every night, scrubbing floors, emptying trash cans, cleaning bathrooms used by people who never learned her name, and he, the man who signed off on executive bonuses, hadn't once known she existed. He closed the folder and took a deep breath, then turned to the HR assistant again. "Do we have security footage from last night?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Would you like me to pull it?" "Please." Half an hour later, he sat alone in a darkened office watching black and white footage from the building's security system. It was nearly midnight on the screen. Emma entered through the side door, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, her long hair tied back in a messy knot. She clocked in, gathered her supplies, and began cleaning, room by room, floor by floor. There was no hesitation, no sloppiness, no rushing. Every movement was efficient and practiced, but also strangely gentle, as if she were taking care of something precious. In one clip, she paused by the executive kitchen, wiping down the granite counters. She reached for a paper towel dispenser, then paused to stretch her back, clearly sore. Her shoulders sagged just slightly before she moved on. There was no drama, no breakdown, no performance. Just quiet endurance. Daniel didn't realize he was holding his breath until the footage ended. The image on the screen faded, replaced by the reflection of his own face, drawn, contemplative, a little older than he had noticed before. For years, he had built his success on precision and control. He was known for his decisiveness, for seeing numbers where others saw emotions, for solving problems with strategy, not sentiment. But this wasn't a problem that could be fixed with a business plan or a memo. He leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the last frame of Emma on the screen. It felt wrong, watching her like this without her knowing. Yet it was the first time he had truly seen her. Not just a staff member. Not just a line on a payroll sheet. A woman who had sacrificed everything for her children and never asked for anything in return. His thoughts returned to Lily and Sophie, how carefully they had dressed, how bravely they had stood in his office, how earnestly they had tried to take on a burden no child should carry. And all because they loved their mother enough to try to carry her exhaustion for her. That kind of loyalty couldn't be bought. That kind of character couldn't be taught. He knew then what he had to do. Returning to his office, Daniel pulled up her file on the internal system. There it was again, Emma Gray. Night cleaning crew. No complaints. No incidents. No missed shifts. Her contact number and address were listed. He stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to call or show up in person. Then he picked up the phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before a nervous, exhausted voice answered. "Hello?" "Ms. Gray," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. "This is Daniel Harris. I believe we need to speak about your daughters." Emma stood in front of the towering glass doors of Harris and Company in the early morning light, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. She hadn't slept. After the police call came and she was told her daughters were safe, and at her employer's office, of all places, her body had gone numb with shock, then flushed with 1,000 emotions at once. Relief. Panic. Embarrassment. Fear. And something else. Confusion. The officer had told her that the CEO himself had found the girls and insisted she come in to meet with him. That was what frightened her the most. She had worked in this building for over 3 years and had never once been summoned beyond the basement service elevator, let alone into the office of Daniel Harris himself. It felt like being asked to step onto another planet. As she entered the lobby, staff and assistants glanced up with polite interest. Her clothes were clean but modest, a navy sweater, dark jeans, worn-out flats. She had tried to tame her hair and hide the tiredness on her face with light makeup, but she still felt like someone who didn't belong. A young receptionist approached her with a clipboard and a nervous smile, clearly briefed but still not quite sure how to speak to the janitor who had somehow become an unscheduled guest of the CEO. "Ms. Gray? Mr. Harris is expecting you. Please follow me." Emma nodded and followed her through the long corridor lined with frosted glass and pristine white walls. Every step made her feel smaller. She thought of her daughters. She couldn't even be angry at them. She was too exhausted, too emotionally spent. Somewhere deep down, a part of her even understood why they had done it. When the assistant opened the door to Daniel Harris's office and stepped aside, Emma froze in place for a second. The room was massive, high-ceilinged and filled with natural light from the windows that overlooked the city. It was elegant but not cold, modern but not impersonal. Bookshelves lined one wall, and a framed photo of what looked like his parents stood on a low table. At the far end of the room, behind the wide oak desk, stood Daniel Harris himself. He wasn't what she expected. He wasn't towering or intimidating in the way some of the executives had seemed during her late-night shifts. He was tall, yes, and serious, but not cold. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a dark tie loosened at the collar. His eyes, a deep brown, looked directly at her with something she couldn't quite define, concern, perhaps, or curiosity. Maybe both. "Ms. Gray," he said gently. "Please, come in. Sit down, if that's all right." She stepped forward slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I want to apologize. I didn't know what my girls had done until it was too late. I've already spoken with the police and—" "You don't need to apologize," he interrupted, his voice calm. "They're not in trouble. Not at all." Emma looked up at him, startled. "In fact," he continued, "they may have given me more perspective in 10 minutes than some executives have managed in 10 years. That threw her off. She sat down cautiously, still unsure what this was about. "I don't understand." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and clasped his hands. "Emma, I've read your file. I know you've worked here for 3 years without a single day off, without a single complaint. You've worked nights, weekends, holidays. Quietly. Invisibly. And we've never recognized that." She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. She wasn't used to being addressed this way, like someone whose time was valuable. "I watched the security footage from last night," he admitted. "I saw how you work. How you move through this place like it matters to you. And then today, your daughters show up with resumes in hand, asking to do your job because they're afraid you're breaking under the weight of it." Her lips parted, but she had no words. Her throat was too tight. He went on. "That's not normal. That's not something children should feel they have to do. But it told me more about your character, and theirs, than any interview ever could." Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted them to worry. I tried to protect them from how hard things have been. I didn't know they saw so much." "They see more than you think," he said gently. "And they love you with everything they've got." There was a silence that stretched between them, filled with something heavy but not unpleasant. Finally, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. "This is a training packet for a new role in our legal department," he said. "We have an opening for a part-time legal assistant. It comes with a mentorship program and remote learning credits. You mentioned in your original application that you had started law school before life changed." Emma stared at the folder as if it were radioactive. "I haven't studied in years. I barely remember any of it. And I don't even have childcare. We'll cover your daughter's school tuition," he said, not missing a beat. "We have a partnership with a private early education program. They can attend full-time. You'll have time to study, to train, and to work. If," he paused, making sure his words came out right, "if that's something you still want for yourself." Emma sat frozen. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. It felt unreal. She had been invisible for so long, surviving one day at a time, never daring to hope for more than rest at the end of a shift. And now, without warning, someone had opened a door she had assumed was locked forever. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," he said simply. Emma looked up, and for the first time in years, something behind her eyes began to lift. She wasn't just tired. She wasn't just grateful. She was awake. Awake in a way she hadn't been since the day she left school with 2 babies in her arms and no road map for how to survive. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe this was her turn. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand announcement, no spotlight moment where Emma Gray stepped into her new life like a scene out of a movie. It happened quietly, steadily, like the soft arrival of spring after a brutal winter. Her first day as a legal assistant was a mixture of nerves, excitement, and deep-rooted doubt. She sat at a modest desk tucked in the far corner of the legal department, surrounded by shelves of case files and the constant hum of printers and phones. Her ID badge felt foreign around her neck, her company email inbox a strange and thrilling territory. She was 32 years old, re-entering a world she had once believed would never welcome her back. The first few weeks were hard. Though Daniel had arranged a flexible schedule and made sure she had access to a mentor, an experienced paralegal named Rachel, Emma still struggled to trust herself. There were moments when legal terminology seemed like a forgotten language, moments when her fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, afraid to type the wrong word. But there were also victories. Small, quiet victories. Understanding a contract clause she hadn't seen in years. Successfully helping draft a memo that was later praised in a meeting. Remembering that she had once belonged to this world and maybe could again. Meanwhile, Lily and Sophie settled into their new school like fish into water. For the first time, Emma didn't have to worry about lunch money or hand-me-down shoes. Their uniforms were fresh and properly fitted, and they came home bubbling with stories about science projects, art classes, and new friends. Emma started arriving home earlier, able to help with homework, able to cook dinner without falling asleep at the stove. She read bedtime stories again. She laughed more. The lines around her eyes began to soften, and the weight in her shoulders eased, bit by bit. And then there was Daniel. In the beginning, their interactions were purely professional. He checked in occasionally, always respectful, never overstepping. But there was something unspoken that lingered between them from that first conversation, something neither of them acknowledged but both quietly understood. It was in the way he remembered details about her day, or how he asked thoughtful questions about her daughters. It was in how she began to notice when he was having a hard day himself, the subtle way his tone shifted or how he rubbed the bridge of his nose when he was tired. He had always been distant with staff, a man of walls and systems, but with Emma, something had changed. One Friday evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Emma was still at her desk reviewing a contract when Daniel walked by and paused. "You're still here," he said, glancing at the time. "I wanted to finish this," she replied. "I'm starting to understand how the language in the indemnity clause works. It finally clicked today." He smiled, that rare kind of smile that softened the sharpness in his features. "I remember the first time it clicked for me. I felt like I had decoded a secret message." She smiled back, nervous but warm. "It's oddly satisfying." There was a pause, and then he said something that shifted everything. "I was about to grab some dinner. Would you join me?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because the idea startled her. Not long ago, she was scrubbing floors in the same building. Now she was being asked to dinner by the CEO. But something in his voice was different. It wasn't about power or status. It wasn't about him saving her or her owing him anything. It was two people, both tired, both survivors in different ways, maybe just looking for a moment of peace. So she said yes. They walked to a quiet restaurant nearby, not one of the sleek places where people networked over oysters and deals, but a cozy, unpretentious place with soft lighting and homemade bread. They talked about their childhoods, his in Boston, hers in upstate New York. They talked about music, books, the kind of movies they liked. He asked her about her husband, and she didn't flinch. She told him about Michael, how kind he'd been, how unfair his death had been, how hard it had been to keep moving afterward. He listened, not like a man checking boxes, but like someone who wanted to carry part of the story with him. She learned about his past too, that he had built his company from the ground up, that he had made mistakes, and that there had been a time when he barely slept, driven by ambition and fear of failure. He admitted that somewhere along the way, he had started to forget why he began in the first place. Her daughters, he said with a quiet smile, had reminded him. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them dared to name. They didn't rush. There were no headlines, no gossip. Just a growing closeness. Shared lunches turned into late-night conversations. Small glances became longer, more meaningful. He started showing up at school events, not in suits but in jeans and sweaters, clapping too loudly at Lily's music recital or crouching down to help Sophie with a science fair display. The girls adored him. Emma noticed how naturally he fit into their lives, how patient he was, how he listened to their wild stories without ever patronizing them. For the first time in years, she began to believe that maybe she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was healing. And so was he. One night, as they walked back from a school play, Emma turned to him under the streetlights, her daughters walking a few feet ahead, chasing each other with scarves. "You've done so much," she said quietly. "For them. For me. I don't know how to thank you." He looked at her with a kind of seriousness that made her heart skip. "You don't owe me anything, Emma," he said. I think you gave me my life back too." They stood there for a moment in the gentle noise of the city. And then, for the first time, he reached out and took her hand. Neither of them said anything else that night. They didn't have to. The silence between them was full of everything they were finally beginning to feel. Autumn arrived with a softness that seemed to settle gently over the city, and with it came a new kind of rhythm for Emma and her daughters, a rhythm not defined by exhaustion or fear, but by something steadier, quieter, and much more rare, stability. Mornings were no longer frantic dashes through dimly lit apartments or hurried goodbyes in the hallway. Instead, Emma walked the girls to school herself most days, their small hands gripping hers as they chatted about art projects, math quizzes, and the latest books they were reading. It was ordinary. And it was everything. At the office, Emma had grown into her new role with quiet determination. She no longer hesitated before speaking in meetings or doubted her instincts when reviewing documents. The staff in the legal department respected her, not because of any connection to Daniel, but because she earned it. Her voice, once soft and uncertain, carried more strength now, shaped by years of hardship and newfound confidence. She had become someone who could command attention without raising her voice, someone who belonged. As for Daniel, his world had changed in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. For a man who had once lived by spreadsheets and efficiency, he found himself lingering over breakfast with the girls, letting them braid his hair into crooked knots while they giggled at how unserious he looked. He became someone who brought home storybooks and tried to cook pancakes on Sundays, usually burning the first batch but laughing at his own failure. It was new, this version of him, more grounded, more human. The people around him noticed. His board members, his staff, even his own siblings had begun to comment on the shift. There was a calm in him now, a kind of softness behind the steel. And it had everything to do with the woman who had once cleaned his floors without him ever knowing her name. Emma had kept her boundaries at first. She was protective of her girls, cautious with her heart. She knew how easily good things could disappear. But over time, the fear gave way to something deeper. She saw how Daniel treated her daughters, not like a man trying to win approval, but like someone genuinely invested in their joy and growth. He celebrated their smallest victories. He sat through their long stories. He showed up. Not just when it was convenient, but always. One evening in late November, after a particularly cold day, Daniel invited Emma and the girls to his apartment for dinner. It had become a quiet tradition over the past few months, Friday dinners together, sometimes takeout, sometimes a home-cooked experiment. That night, he had tried to make chili from his mother's recipe, which resulted in mild chaos and a kitchen dusted in cumin, but the girls declared it the best thing they'd ever tasted, largely because of the sheer effort involved. After dinner, Lily and Sophie retreated to the living room to draw while Emma helped Daniel put away the dishes. The kitchen was warm, the windows fogged slightly from the heat, and the quiet between them was companionable. As they stood side by side at the sink, Daniel suddenly turned to her, wiping his hands on a towel. "I've been thinking about something," he said carefully. Emma looked up from rinsing a bowl. "What's that?" He paused, watching her for a long moment. "You changed my life, Emma. Completely. And not just because of what you do here, or how you've raised the girls, or even how you've survived so much with so much grace. It's you. You've become the center of this world I didn't know I was missing." She blinked, caught off guard. Her breath stilled. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said, his voice low, steady. "Not the dinners, not the school plays, not falling asleep with crayons stuck in the couch cushions. I want this to be our life. All of it. The ordinary, the imperfect, the real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Emma's eyes widened, and she barely managed a whisper. "Daniel. I'm not asking this because I feel obligated," he said quickly, sensing her hesitation. "And I'm not trying to rescue anyone. You've never needed rescuing. I'm asking because I love you. I love the girls. I love the life we've built without even meaning to. And I want to make it official. I want to be your partner. Their father. If you'll have me." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring, nothing flashy, nothing cold. It looked like something chosen with care, something chosen for her. Tears welled in Emma's eyes before she could stop them. She covered her mouth, laughing and crying all at once. "You're serious." "I've never been more serious," he said. Behind them, from the living room, came the quiet voice of Sophie, "Are you marrying our mom now?" They both laughed, turning to find the girls peeking around the corner, their eyes wide and eager. Daniel looked at them, then back at Emma. "If they're okay with it," he said softly. Lily nodded solemnly. "You make her smile. Like really smile." Emma looked at all three of them, her girls, this man, this unexpected life, and for the first time in years, she felt no hesitation. Only gratitude. Only love. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with joy. "Yes. Of course yes." The girls squealed, running in to hug them, and Daniel wrapped his arms around all three, holding on to the family he had never expected to find but now couldn't imagine living without. The wedding was not extravagant, and that was exactly how Emma wanted it. She had spent years surrounded by the cold opulence of places like Harris and Company, polished floors, sharp suits, rooms filled with people who valued power more than kindness. She had no interest in chandeliers or champagne fountains. She didn't want a day built on spectacle. She wanted something real, something that reflected the life they had created out of simple things, trust, laughter, healing, and the deep, quiet kind of love that doesn't demand attention but transforms everything it touches. The ceremony was held in a small garden just outside the city, nestled between tall oaks and trailing ivy. It was early spring, the air still crisp but filled with promise. White folding chairs were lined in neat rows, each decorated with a single ribbon that Lily and Sophie had tied themselves, insisting they be part of every detail. They had also made the invitations, using colored markers and glitter that still clung to the kitchen table weeks later. Every corner of the day held their fingerprints. It wasn't just their mother's wedding, it was the beginning of their family, too. Emma wore a soft ivory dress that brushed her ankles, simple and elegant, with lace at the cuffs and a small row of buttons down the back. Her hair was swept up loosely, with 2 tiny white flowers tucked behind her ear, picked by Sophie that morning. She didn't wear heavy makeup or a veil. She didn't need them. Her face, radiant and calm, told the story of someone who had walked through fire and still found her way to light. Daniel waited for her beneath an arch woven with fresh branches and early blooms, dressed in a navy suit with no tie, his expression soft and reverent. He didn't blink as she walked toward him, one hand held by each of her daughters. Lily looked proud and careful, Sophie beamed so brightly she could have powered the entire ceremony. They reached him together, and Emma placed a kiss on each girl's forehead before taking Daniel's hand. There were no grand speeches, no endless procession of readings. Just a few honest words exchanged between 2 people who had earned every moment of joy through years of sacrifice and patience. Daniel spoke first, his voice low but sure. "When I first met you, I didn't know how to see beyond the walls I'd built around myself. I thought strength meant control, and success meant distance. But you, Emma, you showed me what real strength looks like. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just carries on. You carried your daughters, your grief, your hope, your exhaustion, and still somehow made room for kindness. You changed me. You made me better. I promise to keep choosing you, every day, for the rest of my life." Emma's voice trembled slightly as she answered, but her eyes never left his. "I never expected to be standing here. Not after everything. I didn't think someone like you existed. Someone who could see me, not as a project, not as someone to be rescued, but as a person worth loving. You never asked me to be anything but myself. You didn't just love me. You loved my girls. You gave us space to breathe again. I promise to stand with you the way you stood with us, without hesitation, without fear, with my whole heart." The girls held the rings, Lily balancing Daniel's in a small velvet box, Sophie cradling their mothers like it was the most sacred thing in the world. The moment the rings were exchanged, and the vows sealed, the officiant smiled and said, "By the power vested in me, but more importantly, by the love I see between you, I now pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed, and the girls tackled them in a group hug before the guests even had a chance to applaud. The reception was held under a tent nearby, filled with laughter and music and the kind of warmth that can't be bought. There were no choreographed dances or hired string quartets. Instead, someone brought a guitar, and Lily sang a song she had written with her music teacher, a song about bravery and new beginnings. There were tears all around. Not the sad kind, but the full kind, the kind that arrives when joy is finally allowed space to bloom after years of drought. In the following weeks, nothing changed in any dramatic, headline-worthy way, and yet everything did. They moved into a modest house with a small backyard where the girls could run barefoot in the grass. Emma continued working in the legal department, and Daniel adjusted his schedule to be home more often. The company didn't fall apart without his constant presence. In fact, it improved. He empowered others to lead, learning to delegate, to trust. He had learned that strength also meant knowing when to step back. Dinners were often noisy and messy. School papers covered the fridge. The dog they finally adopted chewed up 2 pairs of Daniel's shoes. But the chaos was welcome. It was real. And so was the peace that came with it. Emma sometimes thought about the version of herself who had once sat on the floor of her apartment, crying behind a locked door so her daughters wouldn't hear. That woman had survived unimaginable loneliness. She wished she could reach back in time and whisper to her, "Hold on. Not just because something better is coming, but because you are worthy of it when it does." And Daniel, once a man ruled by silence and structure, now often found himself lying on the living room rug with coloring books scattered around him, listening to Sophie explain the plot of her latest imaginary story while Lily built towers out of pillows and blankets. In those moments, surrounded by love he never knew he needed, he realized that everything he had built before meant nothing compared to what he had now. They hadn't just created a family. They had built a life where everyone was seen, where no one had to be invisible again. Where love didn't announce itself with grand gestures but showed up every single day, in peanut butter sandwiches, in shared laughter, in quiet hand-holding on the couch. And it was more than enough. It was everything. This story, at its heart, is not about wealth or fairy tale romance. It's about dignity, resilience, and the invisible strength of a mother who kept going when the world gave her nothing. It's about two little girls who saw that strength and refused to let it be buried in silence. It's about how love, when it's real, shows up not with grand gestures but with consistency, humility, and the courage to see someone fully, even when they're kneeling on a tile floor, scrubbing the lives of others. What makes the ending powerful isn't that Emma found a husband or a new job, it's that she reclaimed her voice. She didn't get rescued, she rose. And Daniel didn't save her, he listened, he learned, and in doing so, he was changed too. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most extraordinary beginnings grow out of the quietest, most painful places. And sometimes, the smallest voices, two children with a paper resume, can shake the foundations of an empire and open the door to something truly human. She walked into the office and asked, "Where can I buy a dad?" The Millionaire CEO's world stopped. Let me know if you'd like a formatted version for a storybook, screenplay, or promotional blurb. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Christian Blake stepped into the glass doors of his corporate headquarters. He was dressed sharply, as always, in a pale blue suit that caught the soft morning light just enough to look powerful but not flashy. His brown hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and his blue eyes, normally focused, cold, unreadable, scanned the lobby like they always did. To most people, Christian was the kind of man who could walk into any room and immediately own it. He was known in business circles as precise, unemotional, and unreachable. People respected him, some feared him, but no one got close. He liked it that way. Control was everything. Predictability was survival. That morning, however, was the beginning of something that would change everything. He was halfway across the marble lobby, nodding to his assistant who stood ready with his daily briefing, when he saw something that didn't make sense. Just near the reception desk, sitting quietly on the floor, was a little girl. She was small, maybe 5 or 6, with long blonde hair that curled at the ends and a white dress that looked like it had once been perfect but was now a little wrinkled. Over it she wore a denim jacket, slightly too big, as if it had been handed down. She clutched a small backpack in her lap, the kind with cartoon stars and sparkles, and her sneakers were scuffed. But it wasn't her clothes that struck him. It was her face. Her eyes were wide and the same piercing shade of blue as his. She wasn't crying. She wasn't making a sound. She just sat there like she was waiting for something, or someone. No one else in the building seemed to notice her. Executives walked past in a rush. The receptionist looked nervously at Christian as if unsure whether to call security or pretend everything was fine. Christian stopped walking. Something about this moment made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with logic. He approached the girl slowly, crouched down, and tried to smile, though it came out awkwardly. "Hey there. Are you lost?" The girl looked up at him calmly and said, with absolute seriousness, "Where can I buy a dad?" For a moment, he didn't process the words. He blinked, stunned. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone expected to hear, let alone from a child. The few people who were within earshot turned their heads, some out of confusion, others out of pure discomfort. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he asked, a little softer this time. She didn't repeat herself exactly. She looked straight at him and said, "I want to buy a dad. I saved coins. I need one." Christian felt his throat close. He had handled multi-billion-dollar mergers. He had stood calmly during board takeovers, legal battles, and hostile press conferences. But right now, in front of a child asking to buy a father, he had no idea what to say. Then, something inside him shifted. He looked at her again, not just at the words she said, but at the quiet resolve in her eyes. This wasn't a tantrum or a stunt. She wasn't lost. She had come here for a reason. People around the lobby stared, waiting to see what he would do. The silence stretched, and then he heard himself say something he never would have imagined. "I can be one, for free." She didn't even smile. She simply reached out, wrapped her tiny fingers around his index finger, and said, "Okay. But if you're my dad, you have to help mommy. She's sick, and we have no money." That was when his heart broke completely. The entire room fell silent as he stood up, still holding her hand. His assistant looked panicked. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. For the first time in years, Christian Blake walked away from the boardroom, the schedule, and the perfectly structured life he had built. He let a child lead him, step by step, out of his building, onto the sidewalk, and into the unknown. And he never once looked back. The drive across town was slow, not because of traffic, but because every second felt heavier than the last. Christian Blake sat in the back seat of the car, his driver glancing in the rearview mirror with quiet curiosity, but saying nothing. The little girl sat beside Christian, her small hand still wrapped around his finger, refusing to let go. She didn't speak much. Her eyes stayed on the window, watching the streets change from sleek glass towers to older brick buildings and faded storefronts. Her name, he had learned, was Lily. When he gently asked where they were going, she'd said, "Home," and given an address that Christian didn't recognize, but his driver did. It was in one of the lowest income parts of the city, an area Christian hadn't set foot in since he was a teenager, when life had been much simpler, and everything he now valued, status, distance, invulnerability, hadn't mattered yet. As they turned onto a cracked side street, something about the neighborhood sparked an old memory. A schoolyard. A tiny grocery store. And then it hit him, not just the familiarity of the place, but the possibility of what he might find at the end of this road. He looked at Lily more carefully. Her hair. Her eyes. Her voice. All of it felt strangely close, like an echo from a life he'd locked away. They arrived at a two-story building with peeling paint and a rusted staircase. Lily hopped out of the car and tugged his hand urgently. "This way," she said, already climbing the stairs. Christian followed her through a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of damp wood and old carpet. She stopped in front of a door on the second floor, opened it with a key from her small backpack, and pushed it open. Inside, the apartment was dim and quiet. There were a few toys scattered on the floor and a folded blanket on the worn couch. The kitchen was clean but bare. The walls were lined with old photos and drawings clearly done by a child's hand. And there, lying on a futon near the far window, was a woman. Christian's heart nearly stopped. She looked up as the door creaked, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Her face had changed, thinner, paler, but her eyes were the same. Hazel brown, wide with surprise and something deeper. She tried to sit up, but her body was clearly weak. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "Christian?" He couldn't answer. For a long moment, he just stared at her, stunned and breathless. He walked closer, cautiously, as if the truth might dissolve if he moved too quickly. "Sophia," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded slowly, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "You're really here." He sank into the chair beside her bed, still trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The girl, Lily, stood nearby, watching them both, confused by the silence. Sophia reached out a trembling hand and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said quietly. "How is this possible?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," she said, her voice breaking. "You left for London. You changed numbers. You were gone. I never got a call. A letter. Nothing. I was scared. And then it was too late. And when I realized I was pregnant, she paused, swallowing hard. I didn't want to ruin your life. Christian looked at Lily again. She was sitting on the floor now, calmly pulling a toy from her bag. She's mine, isn't she? Sophia nodded. The words hit him like a tidal wave. He had a daughter. A daughter who had walked into his office and asked to buy a father. A daughter who had been raised without him, by a woman he had once loved and somehow lost. He stood up, overwhelmed, pacing the small room. How long have you been sick? A little over a year, she said. It started small. Fatigue. Dizziness. Then they found the tumor. And you didn't ask for help? I didn't think you'd care. Christian stopped. Those words stabbed deeper than anything. I never stopped caring, he said. I never stopped thinking about you. Sophia closed her eyes, trying not to cry. I couldn't find you. And even if I did, you were so far from this life. I didn't think you'd even remember me. Christian walked back to the chair and sat down heavily. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman in pain, but someone who had fought for years to survive. Someone who had carried their child alone. Someone who had been left behind by more than just him. I'm here now, he said. And I'm not leaving. Sophia looked away. She doesn't know everything. Just that her dad wasn't around. She knows more than you think, he said. She came looking for me. They sat in silence for a long time, broken only by Lily's soft humming in the corner. Christian reached over and gently took Sophia's hand. It was cold and fragile, but she didn't pull away. You need care. Real care. Not this, he said, looking around the apartment. You're coming with me. Both of you. I can't just pick up and leave. I have bills, treatments. I'll take care of it. All of it. Sophia looked at him, eyes narrowed. Why? Because I should have been there, he said. And because I'm not going to let my daughter lose her mother. Not after everything. She didn't answer. But this time, when he stood and gently lifted her from the bed, she didn't resist. And as he carried her out of the apartment, Lily skipped behind them, not understanding the full weight of what had just begun, but knowing, in her innocent way, that something had changed. Something big. Something good. Christian didn't take Sophia and Lily back to his glass and steel condo overlooking the skyline. He knew it wasn't right. That place, while impressive, was cold, curated, and far too sterile for a woman fighting illness and a child who still carried around a stuffed bunny missing one ear. Instead, he brought them to his private estate just outside the city, a quieter place, surrounded by trees and soft hills, with wide windows that let the sunlight in and a fireplace that had burned maybe twice in the last 10 years. It had been empty for a long time, meant for weekends that never came, but now it felt like the only home that made sense. As they entered through the side door, Christian watched Lily's eyes widen. She didn't run or shout like some kids might. She just took it all in, the big wooden staircase, the quiet humming of the air vents, the smell of lemon polish and cedar. She held her mother's hand until they reached the guest suite, where the bed had been made with soft sheets that Christian had asked his housekeeper to put out just that morning. Sophia, still weak and pale, sat slowly on the edge of the bed. Her face showed gratitude but also hesitation, as if she didn't know how to receive this kind of help anymore. Christian knelt in front of her, resting one hand lightly on her knee. You'll stay here. As long as you need. Doctors will come. Everything's taken care of. You don't have to fight alone anymore. She looked at him, clearly exhausted, but there was a spark behind her eyes. I'm not used to people doing things for me. I know, he said. But let me do this. She nodded slowly, and her shoulders relaxed just enough to show she believed him, at least for now. That evening, Christian sat in his study, watching the security monitor quietly as Lily curled up next to her mom on the guest bed. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day about what had happened. No meetings, no calls, not even emails. His assistant had texted over a dozen times, but he let the messages pile up. For the first time in years, work didn't matter. He kept thinking about Lily's voice asking, "Where can I buy a dad?" He'd built a world so far from children and emotions and unpredictability that now, faced with all three, he didn't recognize himself, but he liked who he was becoming. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Sophia sat with Christian by the fireplace. She wore a blanket over her shoulders and sipped warm tea. Her voice was soft, almost afraid of what might come next. "I didn't know if I should tell her who you were. I thought maybe I'd missed my chance." "You didn't," Christian said. "She found me before either of us even had a chance." Sophia smiled faintly. "She's like you in that way. Quiet when she needs to be. Bold when it matters." He glanced at her. "I missed so much." "We both did," she whispered. "But you're here now." They didn't talk about what had come between them, the timing, the missed messages, the mistakes. There would be time for that. For now, they sat quietly, as if afraid that words might ruin the fragile peace forming between them. The following morning, Christian made breakfast. He burned the eggs, spilled orange juice, and set off the smoke alarm once. Lily thought it was hilarious. Sophia sat at the table and laughed until she coughed, and for a brief moment, the room felt like a family had always lived there. Doctors came that afternoon. They examined Sophia gently, respectfully, and Christian made sure she never had to sign a single form. He wanted her to focus on getting better, not worrying about costs or coverage. The diagnosis hadn't changed, she still needed long-term care, but the treatment was now top-level, and more importantly, she no longer had to face it alone. Christian found himself rearranging everything. His schedule shifted. He canceled travel. He delegated more. Grace, his longtime assistant, called him and asked flatly, "Is the world ending?" "No," he replied, staring out at the backyard where Lily was making up a game with sticks and pine cones. "It's just starting." Grace paused, then said quietly, "You sound different." "I feel different," he admitted. In the evenings, they all sat together. Christian read stories out loud, sometimes stumbling over silly voices that made Lily laugh until she couldn't breathe. Sophia began to regain strength slowly. She walked short distances through the house, sat outside with a blanket, and started keeping a journal. Christian caught her once, writing something, and she looked up and smiled. "I'm not just surviving anymore," she said. "I'm remembering who I am." Christian didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, quietly amazed. The woman he'd lost, the child he'd never known, and the home he never knew he needed, all under one roof. It felt fragile, yes, but also incredibly real. And for a man who had built his life on logic, control, and distance, that truth was the most grounding thing he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly began to feel like more than just a temporary haven. It became something warmer, something rooted. The kind of place where shoes were left by the door and laughter came from the kitchen, not just the echo of wealth but the sound of people settling into each other's lives. Christian had never lived like this before. His homes had always been spotless, quiet, curated down to the last imported vase or untouched bookshelf. But now, there were art supplies on the dining room table, tiny socks in the laundry, and children's shows playing in the background. Lily was a force of nature in that way, gentle and soft-spoken, but always leaving her presence in the smallest, most unexpected corners. She didn't need permission to belong. She just did. Sophia, though still recovering, was improving faster than the doctors had anticipated. The treatments were working, and more importantly, her stress levels had decreased dramatically. Christian made sure she had everything she needed, from medications and private physical therapy to time for herself. He set up a quiet reading space in the sunroom just for her, with the same old poetry books she used to love in college, and even tracked down a rare first edition of her favorite author. The day she found it on the armchair, wrapped in linen with a ribbon, she cried. Not because of the gift itself, but because someone had remembered. For Christian, everything was new. He was used to results, to schedules and solutions. But now, he was learning how to be present. He discovered that it took longer to teach Lily how to tie her shoelaces than it did to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. He learned that bedtime stories required patience, and that it was okay to get silly, to mess up voices and laugh at himself. It humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. And yet, it didn't weaken him, it gave him something stronger than control, purpose. Every now and then, when Sophia was feeling well enough, they'd sit on the back porch together after Lily went to bed. They would talk in low voices, not about business or obligations, but about the past, the missing years, the ways their lives had diverged and, by some twist of fate, realigned. Christian had questions, of course. He wanted to know everything, what she had gone through, what she had felt, why she had never told him. And Sophia answered honestly, even when it hurt. She told him about nights spent working 2 jobs, about nearly collapsing on a bus after skipping meals so Lily could eat. She admitted there were moments she wanted to call him, to scream for help, but always talked herself out of it, convinced that he had moved on. I watched interviews of you on TV, she said one night, voice low. You looked like a stranger. Sharp, powerful, untouchable. I didn't know how to fit into that world anymore. You didn't have to, Christian replied, looking at her not with regret, but with something deeper. That world was never real without you in it. She didn't respond right away. But she reached for his hand and held it tightly, not like a gesture of romance, but of understanding. Of forgiveness. Meanwhile, Lily continued to grow more comfortable. She began calling Christian Dad without prompting, just one day while handing him a drawing she made. He nearly dropped his coffee when he heard it. He didn't correct her. He didn't question it. He simply folded the paper carefully and smiled so softly it surprised even him. It was a sketch of the 3 of them, holding hands beneath a giant sun. Over their heads, in crooked blue letters, she had written one word, family. That evening, Christian tucked her in and sat at the edge of her bed longer than usual. She asked him if he was going to be there in the morning. He answered without hesitation, always. And he meant it. Not just as a promise, but as a choice. For the first time in his life, Christian Blake wasn't chasing the next goal, the next deal, or the next title. He was choosing something harder, being a father, a partner, and a man who showed up when it mattered. He had built empires, yes. But now, he was building something more fragile and far more valuable. He was building a life. The first real test of this new life came not in the form of illness or legal complications, but in something surprisingly ordinary, a parent-teacher meeting at Lily's preschool. Christian had never been to anything like it before. The invitation had come home in Lily's backpack, a crumpled paper smudged with marker and crumbs. Sophia had been resting that day after a long treatment session, and Christian had offered to go in her place, thinking it would be a simple check-in. He wore a navy blue sweater instead of a suit, left his phone in the car for once, and arrived 10 minutes early, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He wasn't used to fluorescent lights and bulletin boards filled with construction paper handprints. He didn't know how to make small talk with other parents or sit on tiny chairs without looking completely out of place. When the teacher, Miss Howard, greeted him with a warm smile and gestured for him to sit, Christian awkwardly folded himself into a seat clearly not designed for someone over 6 feet tall. She opened a folder labeled Lily Blake and began walking him through her progress, how she was quiet but observant, how she always helped the other children clean up without being asked, how she once gave away her snack to a classmate who forgot theirs. Christian listened carefully, deeply focused, as if it were a business presentation. But as the teacher continued, she hesitated, lowering her voice slightly. "She told me something last week," Miss Howard said, tapping her fingers gently on the edge of the folder. "She said her dad used to live in the clouds, but he came down when she asked for him." That's how she described it. Christian froze. He wasn't sure what to say. A lump formed in his throat before he could speak. "I just thought you should know," the teacher added gently. "Whatever you've done for her, it's working. She feels safe. That means more than test scores or behavior charts." When he got back home that afternoon, Christian sat in his car longer than usual, staring at the house he used to see as just a structure. Now it felt like something alive, something that carried the breath of the people inside it. Lily ran out the front door to greet him, a paint smear on her cheek and a ribbon half untied in her hair. She hugged his leg like she'd been waiting all day, and when he picked her up, she rested her head on his shoulder without saying a word. He held her tightly, his hand gently cradling the back of her head, breathing in the scent of markers and apple juice. Inside, Sophia was feeling better. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a few papers spread out before her, forms for a part-time writing program she had been considering. She looked up as he entered and read his expression instantly. "What happened?" she asked softly. He placed Lily gently on the couch, letting her pull out her toys, then turned to Sophia with a voice filled with something close to wonder. "She said I came down from the clouds." Sophia blinked. "She did?" He nodded, sitting down beside her. "I never thought I'd be someone's safe place." "You are," Sophia said, reaching for his hand. "Even when you weren't here, she felt you. Somehow." Christian looked down, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was becoming. Not because he was unsure of it, but because it mattered so much. And because for the first time, he was beginning to feel worthy of it. Later that week, Sophia had a checkup. This time, Christian went with her, not just as support but as a partner. They sat side by side in the waiting room, flipping through outdated magazines and sharing quiet jokes. When her name was called, he helped her stand and walked with her into the examination room. The doctor, kind but firm, gave them cautious optimism. The tumor had shrunk, her body was responding, and if things continued at this pace, she might not need a second round of intensive therapy. Sophia let out a shaky breath and leaned back in the chair, her eyes glistening with exhaustion and relief. Christian exhaled, feeling as if the air had been knocked out of him. "You're going to get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. Outside the clinic, they stood in the parking lot under a wide gray sky. Sophia looked up at him and said, "I didn't think I'd ever have anything to hope for again." He looked at her and replied, "Now you have a future. And I want to be in it." That night, they cooked dinner together. Well, Christian tried, and Sophia supervised from a stool, laughing when he oversalted the pasta and spilled half the sauce. Lily sat at the table drawing again, another picture of the three of them with hearts floating above their heads. She handed it to him with a serious expression and said, "This one's for your office. So you don't forget us when you work." He looked at the drawing, then at the child in front of him, then at the woman across the kitchen, and felt something he had never known before, the kind of peace that didn't come from achievement, but from presence. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his briefcase, not because he would forget, but because he never wanted to forget what really mattered. Fall arrived quietly, brushing its fingers over the city in fading sunlight and cooler evenings. The trees surrounding Christian's home began to blush with orange and red, and Lily, ever curious, collected leaves on their walks and kept them pressed between the pages of her coloring books. Life inside the house had started to move with a rhythm of its own, no longer dictated by emergencies or adjustments, but by small, gentle routines. Mornings were filled with soft chatter, toast, and the occasional spilled juice. Afternoons carried laughter from the backyard, where Christian had finally agreed to build a small wooden playhouse, mostly because Lily had asked so sweetly he couldn't say no. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the three of them gathered for dinner, sometimes messy, always real. Sophia's health continued to improve. She had begun walking without assistance, climbing stairs slowly but with growing confidence. Her cheeks had more color now, and her voice, once quiet from fatigue, had begun to reclaim its natural strength. She spoke more openly, laughed more freely, and even started writing again. Christian had turned one of the guest rooms into a small study for her. He stocked it with journals, books, and a view of the garden that always seemed to calm her. It became her space, one where she could rediscover parts of herself that illness had tried to erase. She once told him that being in that room felt like remembering who she was before everything became survival. Christian, meanwhile, was changing in ways no one from his past world would have recognized. He still worked, of course, but less obsessively. He kept meetings concise, refused late-night calls, and took weekends entirely offline. His assistant, Grace, had stopped asking if he was feeling all right and instead started sending him parenting articles and notes like, "Lily's class has a field trip, don't miss it." He appreciated that more than he let on. One night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Sophia found Christian in the kitchen, sitting with a cup of tea he hadn't touched. He looked distracted, eyes fixed on something invisible. She sat beside him and waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and full of thought. "I spent years thinking power meant being untouchable. That if I could control everything, I'd be safe. But this," he gestured vaguely, "this is the first time I feel like I'm living." Sophia smiled at him, not with pity but with understanding. "Because you finally let yourself be part of something bigger than you," she said. "And you didn't lose anything. You gained everything." Christian reached across the table, his fingers curling around hers. He hadn't planned to fall in love again. In fact, he'd thought that part of his life had closed long ago, locked behind doors of old memories and regret. But now, sitting across from the woman he had once lost and the child they had unknowingly created, he felt something solid take root in his chest. He was no longer running from silence, or chasing success to outrun emptiness. He was still. And in that stillness, he felt whole. That weekend, they took a trip to a nearby lake. It wasn't extravagant or planned with precision. They packed snacks, sweaters, and Lily's endless supply of questions. They rented a small boat and drifted for hours across the water. Lily lay across their laps at one point, eyes closed, completely at peace. Sophia leaned her head on Christian's shoulder, and he kissed the top of her hair without even thinking. The moment required no words. It was one of those rare slices of time where nothing needed to be said because everything important was already felt. Later that night, while Lily slept in the back seat during the drive home, Sophia turned to him with a quiet smile and asked, "Did you ever imagine your life would look like this?" He laughed under his breath. "Not even close." "Do you miss the old version of it?" she asked. "No," he said. "I only miss that I didn't find this sooner." As the car rolled through the soft shadows of tree-lined streets, they drove forward into a life that neither of them had expected but both knew they were meant to build. And for Christian, who had spent his entire adulthood chasing a sense of arrival, he finally understood that this ordinary, imperfect, beautiful moment, was it. He was already home. The first snow came earlier than expected, blanketing the city in white before Thanksgiving. It caught everyone by surprise except Lily, who greeted the morning frost with squeals of delight and her boots on the wrong feet. Christian helped her into her puffy jacket while Sophia watched from the doorway, wrapped in a wool scarf, a faint smile on her face. She still tired easily, but the color had returned to her cheeks and her laughter was more frequent now, lighter, as if something heavy had finally lifted. That morning, they built a crooked snowman in the front yard, complete with a carrot nose and one of Christian's designer ties, which Lily thought was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. He didn't mind. In fact, he made a point to leave it on the snowman for the neighbors to admire. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. Sophia had taken to baking again, something she hadn't done in years. The act of mixing and kneading seemed to calm her, and the kitchen filled with quiet music and the rhythm of a home rediscovered. Christian, who once ordered dinner from five-star restaurants with a single phone call, now knew the names of baking tools he never knew existed. He didn't mind that, either. Every day brought new rituals, ones he had never imagined himself part of but now couldn't imagine his life without. But it wasn't all without challenges. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Christian walked into the study to find Sophia sitting in the armchair, her journal open on her lap, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. She tried to hide it, wiping her face quickly, but he knelt beside her and waited without saying a word. After a few moments, she whispered that sometimes she still woke up afraid, that all of this was temporary, that one bad scan could take it away, that Christian might one day realize this life was too small for him. He reached up and touched her face gently, looking into her eyes with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. He told her that nothing about this was small. That she and Lily had given his life meaning in a way no amount of success ever had. He said he wasn't leaving, not now, not ever, and if fear came again, they would face it together. She didn't respond right away, but the way she leaned into him said more than words ever could. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Christian received a call from a non-profit organization that provided housing and legal support for single mothers. They had heard of his recent anonymous donations and invited him to speak at their winter fundraiser. At first, he declined. He wasn't ready to tell the world what had happened, what had changed. But Sophia encouraged him. She said that his story wasn't just his anymore, that if it could inspire even one person to step forward for someone in need, it was worth sharing. So he agreed. The night of the fundraiser, Christian stood on a modest stage in a small auditorium, wearing a simple suit and no tie. He didn't have a speech prepared. He spoke from memory, from the heart. He told them about a little girl who walked into his office one morning and asked to buy a dad. He told them how that moment shattered everything he thought he knew about life, and how it led him to rediscover a love he thought he had lost forever. He spoke about the quiet strength of a woman who raised their daughter alone, and the way love had found its way back into his life through a second chance he never expected. The room was silent when he finished. No applause at first, just stillness, the kind that comes from people feeling something real. And then the clapping began, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't just for him, it was for what his story represented: hope, change, redemption. Afterward, when he returned home that night, Sophia met him at the door with a quiet look of pride. Lily was already asleep, but they stood together in the hallway for a long moment. Christian pulled her close, his voice low and steady, and said, "Thank you for believing I could be more than what I was." Sophia smiled, pressed her forehead to his, and replied, "Thank you for becoming exactly who we needed." That night, as snow fell gently outside and the world around them moved on unaware, their home remained full, of warmth, of stories, of second chances. And in the silence between words, something unspoken settled permanently into place. They were no longer rebuilding. They were already whole. Spring returned slowly, melting away the cold and quiet degrees, and with it came the feeling that life was no longer being rebuilt, it was simply being lived. The trees outside the Blake house bloomed pale pink, the air was filled with the scent of wet earth and new beginnings, and laughter returned to the garden like it had been waiting all winter for permission. Lily had grown taller. Her shoes no longer slipped off her heels, and her drawings had more detail, more color, and often showed four figures now: herself, her mom, Christian, and a small baby with a smile the size of the sun. She had begun asking, with the boldness only a child could manage, whether they could make her a little brother or sister. Christian nearly choked on his tea the first time she asked, but Sophia had just laughed, her eyes shining in a way that hadn't been there a year ago. The rhythms of their life felt settled but far from routine. There was warmth in their chaos, comfort in their imperfection. Christian continued to split his time between work and home, but everyone at his company had long since accepted that his priorities had changed. He had become the kind of leader who left early for school plays, who scheduled meetings around doctor appointments, and who once paused a shareholder call because Lily wanted to show him a butterfly she had caught in the garden. Strangely, the company had never run smoother. He no longer micromanaged because he no longer felt the need to prove himself every second. He had nothing to prove. His fulfillment didn't live in the numbers anymore. Sophia had returned to writing with fierce grace. Her essays about motherhood, resilience, and unexpected redemption began circulating online, gaining quiet attention for their honesty and raw beauty. A small publisher offered her a book deal, and when she showed Christian the contract, his hands trembled slightly, not out of concern, but from pride. He told her it was only the beginning, and she told him she already had everything she needed. The manuscript grew page by page, written between nap times, evening walks, and cups of coffee that went cold from distraction. Lily would sit on the floor beside her as she wrote, coloring or asking questions about the story. Sophia would smile and answer every one, never brushing her daughter aside, even when her thoughts were deep in revision. One Sunday morning, under soft sun and scattered petals, Christian took them both to the park. It was the same park he'd passed 1,000 times without ever entering, too busy, too disconnected. But that day, they brought a blanket, a basket of food, and no agenda. Sophia lay in the grass with her eyes closed, soaking in the sun, while Lily chased ducks near the pond. Christian sat back, watching them, the weight of his old life falling further and further behind him. He used to think peace was boring, but now he knew it was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever felt. Later that evening, when the sky turned orange and the air began to cool, they walked home slowly. Lily skipped between them, one hand in each of theirs. She began humming a song she'd made up, and Christian listened, catching pieces of the lyrics. She sang about finding things, about families you didn't know you had, and about daddies who come down from the clouds. He glanced at Sophia, who was already watching him. She mouthed the word miracle, and he didn't disagree. When they reached the house, Sophia paused at the front door. She looked at Christian and, after a long breath, asked him if he still wanted what they had spoken about months ago, something permanent, something legal, something that said in writing what had already become true in their hearts. Christian answered not with words, but by pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. He hadn't been sure when the moment would come, but he had known it would. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, nothing flashy, just like her. Sophia didn't cry right away. She held his face in her hands and kissed him once, softly, like sealing a promise. Lily clapped from the steps, not fully understanding but sensing it was something big and beautiful. That night, they told stories over dinner, stories from the past and dreams of the future, and it felt like the walls of the house listened, holding those memories safe inside them. Months later, the wedding was quiet, just close friends, a backyard strung with fairy lights, and Lily throwing flower petals with unmatched enthusiasm. Sophia wore a dress she'd chosen herself, nothing extravagant, just something that made her feel strong and beautiful. Christian, in a tailored gray suit, looked at her like the world had finally made sense. They exchanged vows not written by anyone else but spoken in their own imperfect, honest words. And when the ceremony ended, and Christian lifted Lily in his arms to join their first dance, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. The life they built was not one born from perfection. It was shaped by missed chances, broken paths, and pain that still lingered in quiet corners. But it was also shaped by forgiveness, by showing up when it mattered, by love that chose to stay even when it had every excuse to leave. Christian had once believed that happy endings were for other people, but he knew now that real happiness wasn't the end of the story, it was the part you fought to build after all the chapters where everything could have fallen apart. And this messy, beautiful, everyday life, was exactly the ending he never knew he deserved. This story's ending is powerful not because everything turns out perfectly, but because it turns out authentically. It's about healing, not erasing the past. What makes the conclusion so meaningful is that it doesn't rely on dramatic twists or grand gestures. It leans into quiet, steady love, and the slow rebuilding of trust and connection. The millionaire CEO doesn't just discover he has a daughter, he discovers the kind of man he wants to be, and that transformation feels earned. The beauty lies in how broken things were allowed to mend without pretending they were never broken. Sophia's forgiveness isn't instant, and Christian's growth isn't effortless. That realism grounds the emotional weight of their reunion. And Lily, the innocent thread connecting them, reminds us that hope often comes from the most unexpected voices. In the end, this is a story about second chances, not the kind handed out easily, but the kind fought for. And in that fight, a new kind of wealth is found, family, love, and a peace money can't buy. That's the kind of ending that stays with you.